Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, excellencies. I'm Professor Adam Dixon, the Adam Smith Chair here at Panmure House. It's my pleasure and a genuine honor to welcome you here this morning in a place that holds a unique and consequential position, not only in Scotland's history, but in the economic and intellectual history of the modern world. Many of you will have made your way here this morning down the Royal Mile. Edinburgh's Royal Mile, past the kilt shops, the whiskey merchants, and the tartan-clad window displays. Now these, of course, offer one version of Scotland. The Scotland of Bonnie Prince Charlie, Sir Walter Scott, and more recently the television phenomenon Outlander. Now, while those images are not without their charm, the most significant events in Scotland's history, indeed, some of the most important events in the history of ideas, did not happen on battlefields or in royal palaces. They happened here. This house, Panmure House, is the last surviving residence of Adam Smith, one of the greatest architects of modern thought. Built in 1691 for the Earl of Panmure, it became Smith's home for the last 12 years of his life, between 1778 and 1790. It was here that he continued to refine his two great masterworks, The Theory of Moral Sentiments and The Wealth of Nations, which has a birthday next year, 1776. And it was here that he hosted and debated with fellow giants of the Scottish Enlightenment, thinkers such as James Hutton or Adam Ferguson, and others such as the Anglo-Irish statesman Edmund Burke. Thinkers whose ideas fundamentally reshaped the way the world thinks about morality, economics, government, and society. From the beginning of the 18th century through to the 19th, Scotland experienced one of the most remarkable transformations in human development. A country that was desperately poor, marginal, and isolated on the periphery of Europe was transformed into one of the richest, most industrialized, and most intellectually vibrant societies in the world. What happened in Scotland in the 18th century, in the meeting houses, the universities, in the drawing rooms of Edinburgh, and here in Panmure House, was nothing short of extraordinary. The ideas forged here shaped not just Britain's future, but global debates about markets, trade, freedom, justice, and the responsibilities of the individual within society. Adam Smith, in particular, was a passionate advocate for free and open trade, but also deeply mindful of the moral responsibilities that individuals and institutions must carry in society. He understood that prosperity could not exist in a vacuum, that it had to be accompanied by fairness, by trust, and a concern for the common good. And those lessons resonate more powerfully than ever in an age where global trade and investment is again fraught with uncertainty, where artificial intelligence and technological upheaval are transforming economies, and where prosperity in many places is fragile and uneven. When Heriot-Watt University and Edinburgh Business School acquired this house in 2008, it was not simply to restore and preserve a historic building, but to revive a center of ideas, to make Panmure House once again a place where people gather to debate, to reflect, and to help shape the ideas and policies that will define the next century. And it is entirely fitting then that we gather here this morning to hear a speech on Scotland's economic ambitions and its place in the global economy, in the company of business leaders, investors, and diplomatic delegations from Japan, China, the United States, India, Brazil, Germany, Romania, and Ireland. It is my sincere hope, and perhaps, if I may be so bold, a suggestion, that this gathering marks the beginning of a tradition. Much like the Mansion House speech in London provides an annual moment for the British government to set out its economic priorities, let this become a yearly fixture at Panmure House. A moment when the Deputy First Minister, or the First Minister, or whoever holds those offices in the future, comes here to reaffirm Scotland's identity as a forward-looking, dynamic, and globally engaged economy. A nation that honors its Enlightenment inheritance, not as a relic of the past, but as a framework for meeting the challenges of the present and the opportunities of the future. And so, it is with great pleasure that I invite to the lectern a leader who understands both Scotland's remarkable economic inheritance and the responsibilities of charting its future course. Please join me in welcoming the Deputy First Minister of Scotland, Kate Forbes. Thank you so much. Please.
Good morning, and thank you so much for the warm welcome, and great to see some familiar faces in the audience today. You'll understand when I say this as a proud Highlander that what I think I just heard from Professor Adam Dixon is that whilst Edinburgh offered the drawing rooms of sophisticated intelligence, the unruly Highlanders contributed the charm and the conflict, which still make for great TV. So that legacy lasts today. But thank you so much for the invitation here to Panmure House and for hosting us in such a historic building. Thank you also to Heriot-Watt University. And as we've just heard in the introduction, it was of course here that Adam Smith wrote the final edition of The Wealth of Nations in 1789. And in that, as you will know, Smith developed the themes from his earlier work, the theory of moral sentiments, which is concerned not only with what today we would call the functioning of the economy and economic growth, but also with its social impact. Because as Adam Smith said, when, and I quote, people pursue their own interest, they can also help deliver for wider society. And that quotation is the theme of my remarks today and probably captures more than anything else what we are trying to achieve through our own economic ambitions in Scotland today. Because I would like to reflect on the importance of private investment in our economy and explore why strong collaboration between the public and the private sector matters for our future growth and for future prosperity, yes, and that is hardly a news flash, but also delivers great social goods for our country. Investment, both public and private, is vital if we are to achieve not only our economic ambitions, but also our social ambitions too, because it means higher wages. It means thriving high streets. It means strong public services and the elimination of child poverty. We cannot do any of the things that we want to do, put more money in people's pockets, reach net zero, improve our public services, all of which are highly in demand by the public. We cannot do any of those things without increasing the level of private investment into our economy and making Scotland the most attractive destination that we can for that investment. Now in Scotland we have a relatively strong record in attracting foreign direct investment, second only to London and the southeast of England, according to EY. We have lots of examples of investment and the creation of good, well-paid jobs here to point to. But overall, private investment, private capital investment has lagged behind other developed economies. A decade or more of austerity have very much constrained our capacity to use public expenditure to stimulate private investment, particularly since in Scotland we have more limited economic levers at our disposal. And the fact is that for many years, persistently low levels of investment in Scottish businesses and Scottish projects, due in part to that focus on London and the South East, have held us back and hampered economic growth. And that matters. It matters because if we matched the average level among OECD countries, our GDP could be a percentage point higher by 2035. That equates to nearly £2 billion. And if that increased level of investment in turn increased productivity levels across the Scottish economy, quite obviously, you get double the impact. But those numbers, large though they may be, pale by comparison with the scale of the wider opportunity before us. UK investment institutions manage nearly £11 trillion in global assets. Scottish-based firms alone manage some £490 billion. If we can secure more of that capital for Scottish businesses and Scottish projects, the effect is nothing short of transformational. And so today I want to talk about the work that I am undertaking to ensure that we are grasping those opportunities and making the most of our economic potential without losing sight of what that means for our people, for our communities, and for social value. Our approach to investment has been guided by the work of the Investor Panel, a group of external experts in investment finance brought together by the then First Minister to provide a private sector perspective on how governments can attract the mobile capital investment needed to support a just transition to net zero. They reported in October 2023. It's a brilliant report. If you haven't read it, I would strongly encourage you to read it. And they were clear that any country seeking to attract investors, firstly, needs to be clear in its strategic direction. Secondly, must build strong and effective relationships. And thirdly, has to deliver swiftly and confidently. No pressure. We need to demonstrate by our words and our actions that we get that we understand the needs and the priorities of investors. Clearly, those seeking to invest are always looking for the most advantageous use of their assets. And government needs to show that we understand that investors require a return on investment commensurate with that risk. Fundamentally, I see our job to provide the clarity and the consistency needed to reduce risk and to tackle what causes uncertainty, namely the blockers and the barriers. To ensure that the public sector works cohesively, effectively and quickly to support investors and to take action to deal with issues and problems as and when they arise. I have communicated with all parts of the public sector that they should see themselves as part and parcel of our economic development work. And stimulating economic growth and attracting private investment isn't only in the domain of our enterprise agencies or the National Investment Bank. Ensuring that we are prioritising support for public services and investment and in rejecting an austerity approach. And so the Scottish Government's programme of work, announced last September to attract private capital investment at scale, fits into 3 strategic priority areas. And as soon as you create a list of priorities, lots of people put their hands up to ask why their sector isn't represented, but that is the nature of a priority list. And so our priority list for attracting private investment is the transition to net zero, housing, and public infrastructure. And the First Minister has asked me to take on the role and challenge of being that so-called investment champion to manage the work on a cross-government level. Through that work, in direct response to the recommendations of the Investor Panel, we have, firstly, created a single national pipeline of strategic investment opportunities. We had multiple different pipelines. The difference now is that it's all in one place. Secondly, improving our approach to investor relations across the public sector, being far more strategic, being far more intentional about engaging with investors, both domestic investors and inward investors, both those who are already investing and those who have their eye on potential investments. And lastly, and perhaps most interestingly for those that are technically minded, looking at how we use financing models and instruments in the most effective way to de-risk projects, partnering public and private sector investment to make something happen. And so firstly, in creating that national project pipeline, we've gathered all the available on-the-ground intelligence held by our delivery bodies in one place. We've collated our knowledge in this way, and in this way we're able to analyse opportunity areas identify the common barriers to investment, and importantly, bring that knowledge into our conversations with the investment community. I want to have real, meaningful and honest discussions with investors about investing in Scotland. I'm too busy to have meetings that aren't characterised by that. And the development of a single national project pipeline is an important asset in ensuring that those conversations are of the highest value to the investor and also of the highest value to government. Later this year, we'll launch Invest Scotland, a new portal that will showcase these investment opportunities, essentially the front end of the work that we've done at the back end to create the pipeline. And that will showcase investment opportunities and information, and importantly, provide a single point of entry to government. We have a powerful brand identity in Scotland. We need to fully showcase that to global investors. And to put it simply, we are making our investment offer as strong as possible, as visible as possible, and as clear as possible. On that second objective, work is also underway to improve the public sector approach to engaging with key investors and project sponsors, to make it easier to work with government. Delivering that involves looking at the capabilities of the different players in the public sector system, including across central and local government, our enterprise agencies, Scottish Futures Trust, the Scottish National Investment Bank, and Crown Estate Scotland. But I don't want it to end just there, and also bring in other public sector organisations that may not see themselves as being in the business of attracting private investment, but often can make the difference of a deal being done or not done. That will deliver a more agile, systematic and proactive approach from Team Scotland as a whole to investors or developers who want to hear about what Scotland has to offer, but more than that, need to move it into the territory of specific opportunities. I think it's well known that our natural strengths and our policy environment make us an attractive destination for investment. We need to communicate that. And to do that, I'm accelerating a targeted programme of proactive engagement with key capital investors, and I'm committed to tackling potential barriers and blockers to investment quickly and decisively. In March this year, the First Minister and I hosted a successful global offshore wind investment forum here in Edinburgh, and it was one of the recommendations of the investor panel. So it's always nice to look back at a report with recommendations and to tick at least one of those recommendations off as having been delivered. We brought together 100 investors, developers and public sector partners to raise general awareness, profile specific investment opportunities in the offshore wind sector in Scotland, but to focus on deal making, on negotiations, to not only create the forum where the supply chain could engage with the developers, but for us to engage with investors, some of whom we hadn't engaged with previously. The forum provided a springboard for future targeted investor engagement to support delivery of our offshore wind ambitions, which you will understand fits very neatly into one of those 3 priority areas I talked about. So the third strand of our programme, having talked about targeted engagement, having talked about the pipeline, the third strand of our programme is to look at how we use financing models and instruments in the most effective way to de-risk and attract new private investment. I was joking in another speech, and it's not really a joke, but I was making the comment in another political speech that every year we think this must be the most uncertain year yet, and then the following year proves us wrong. But with the global headwinds, the uncertainties on an international level, and some of the very real challenges that businesses are grappling with, uncertainty seems to characterise our day. And so my job is to understand how I can inject more certainty and less risk into the engagements we have with investors. For example, we're working with the Scottish National Investment Bank and others to consider how public sector guarantees can be used. We're identifying projects that could be suitable for revenue financing or public-private partnerships. And we're continuing to progress work towards an inaugural bond, another recommendation of the investor panel. Not delivered yet, but making good progress. We're also working to ensure that the regime for devolved taxes is as supportive as possible for private investment. For example, on land and buildings transaction tax, where we'll be consulting before the summer recess, which means in the next 3 weeks, on reliefs in relation to collective investment vehicles. In all of those areas, we are continuing to engage widely with the investment community, understanding what they identify as primary blockers, and then doing anything within our power to reduce that. So that essentially is the shape of the work that we are doing. But I mentioned earlier 3 strategic areas that I'm focused on when it comes to investment potential: net zero, housing, and public infrastructure. Offshore wind is, of course, one of our most significant investment opportunities. It's a sector with incredible potential. For decades, long-standing policy certainty provided by the Scottish Government and a significantly large pipeline of projects across both the offshore wind sector itself and the investment opportunities in port infrastructure. And I realise I'm in the presence of some experts when it comes to port infrastructure, and supply chain companies has ensured that Scotland is at the forefront of those opportunities. We have been taking real action now to deliver, investing up to £500 million over 5 years. That's expected to leverage additional private investment of £1.5 billion in the infrastructure and manufacturing facilities critical to growth in the offshore wind sector. And it's an area that I am particularly keen to see progress. That the more we can develop and deliver now in the supply chain, the more value there will be when developments get over the line, and the more likely they are to use local content because there is a well-developed local supply chain. And activity is gaining pace. You will all know about the investment from Sumitomo, a landmark commitment to invest £350 million in a cable manufacturing facility at Nigg, backed by £24.5 million of public sector investment. And since May last year, we've committed over £68 million investment in port infrastructure for offshore wind, leveraging private investment and driving progress on the enabling infrastructure that's critical to realising Scotland's offshore wind. So despite the remarks I made at the outset about what the Highlands have contributed to Scotland's history, I can assure you that we are contributing substantially to Scotland's future because of the scale of investment that is happening right now across the Highlands in the supply chain. And in that spirit, it is my enormous pleasure to announce today that we are continuing to build on that strong foundation with a multi-million pound investment in one of Scotland's most strategically important ports, Kishorn Port. This is one of the most significant public investments in our port infrastructure in decades. Through Highlands and Islands Enterprise, we'll invest up to £24 million at Kishorn Port to enhance capacity and capabilities, and those expanded facilities are forecast to attract projects supporting up to 1,500 jobs. And why does that project excite me so much? Because going right back to the quotation from Adam Smith about social value and economic growth, those of you that have ever been to Kishorn, and if you haven't, I strongly recommend it. If you've got the guts and the bravery to try the Bealach, the highest road in the UK, Kishorn is one of the areas of Scotland suffering most from depopulation. Decades ago, it was a hive of activity, creating jobs, attracting people to an area that had perhaps been abandoned and forgotten. And then it lay semi-derelict until an enterprising entrepreneur saw its potential in and around the decommissioning work. And seeing it come back to life now is remarkable. And for me, it is a symbol of why the private investment-led projects backed with public sector funding are not just about GDP figures. They transform communities, they change lives, they eradicate poverty, and I think we should be incredibly proud of the way in which the private sector delivers on those objectives. That investment is a clear signal from the Scottish Government and Highlands and Islands Enterprise, giving investors the confidence to invest millions more in this area's wider infrastructure, economy and people. The two other areas, and I'll keep moving at pace, is of course housing. Critically important for growth and for the well-being of the people who live here. Delivering the right sort of housing in the right places is key to realising the transformational economic opportunities of major projects like the Inverness and Cromarty Firth Green Freeport. It's why the Programme for Government committed us to implementing the recommendations of the Housing Investment Task Force, which will be published alongside our response imminently. The work that's been done by that group has been immensely valuable, allowing us to draw on the expertise of people and organisations at the front line of investment and delivery across Scotland. The task force has identified practical actions to support more investment across the affordable, the private and investment sectors, and support new and existing business models to deliver at scale. And we're committed to responding immediately to allow the investment conditions to flourish. We've already taken some of the recommended actions, and the influence of the task force is notable in areas like our response in stage 2 of the housing bill. We need to seize the momentum generated by the task force's work to show unequivocally how we value investment, particularly in growth areas like build to rent. And it is important that that sentence that I've just said is heard loud and clear. And that is in addition to existing support and investment. We're directly investing in housing through our £768 million budget this year for affordable housing supply and creating the wider policy and regulatory environment to support private investment in housing. We're conscious of the enormous untapped potential of Scottish pension funds to invest in Scottish companies and Scottish projects. And that's why we've also committed to a programme of work with the Scottish Local Government Pension Scheme and others over the coming year to look at ways that we can secure more co-investment by both public and private pension funds. So that's a watch this space. And the National Investment Bank and our enterprise agency have a critical role to play too. They make commercial investments. The bank makes commercial investments, debt and equity, in businesses and projects in line with the strategic missions set by Scottish ministers. And as Scotland's impact investor, they are playing a critical role right across the Scottish economy. To date, those investments of almost £800 million have also helped drive in over £1.4 billion of third-party co-investment and support from our enterprise agencies for businesses and infrastructure. And that also leverages significant private sector investment. In June last year, the bank committed £20 million investment into Zero Avia, a developer and manufacturer of zero-emission engines for commercial aviation. That was their first investment in hydrogen-based technology and the sustainable aviation sector. That financing was a critical step in the company's overall production plans to bring its clean aviation engine technology to market. And then in February this year, with the National Wealth Fund co-investing £43.5 million, and the bank has committed £10 million investment into sustainable packing technology company Pulpex to support the construction of their first commercial scale manufacturing facility near Glasgow. And that planned facility will be capable of manufacturing 50 million bottles per year and create 35 new jobs. There's a point there about co-investment across the UK. And over the last few years, last year in particular, I think you'll have seen more co-investments between UK government-run institutions and Scottish government institutions like the bank. Because investments from the National Wealth Fund and the bank are critical to the industrialisation of first-of-kind technologies and future uptake. Aventus's groundbreaking plan to redevelop Ardesir Port is perhaps another of these examples. I don't know if I mentioned, but that's also in the Highlands. So not that I'm biased in any way, but formerly an oil and gas fabrication yard into a hub for floating offshore wind projects, they've secured £400 million of funding, £300 million private sector investment and £100 million credit facility from the UK National Wealth Fund, which used to be the UK Investment Bank and the Scottish National Investment Bank. And in November 24, as part of the offshore wind investment programme, the Scottish National Investment Bank announced an investment of £20 million in subsea cable manufacturer XLCC. And I had the great privilege of being in the United Arab Emirates with XLCC, engaging with investors in February. And in February, the bank announced £6.7 million for subsea micropiles alongside £2.5 million co-investment from Marubeni to develop technology that will unlock opportunities in floating offshore wind, again part of the Offshore Wind Investment Forum. There's other announcements that I won't list. In February this year, Highlands and Islands Enterprise announced £5 million for the Scapa Deepwater Quay project. The point of these is that I'm not standing before you just talking about future pipeline, future opportunities, and how we will deliver. I am saying that, but I am also saying that in the last year, we're already seeing the evidence of a different approach and a shift in emphasis. We recognise the need for close and effective collaboration with the UK government. At the Offshore Wind Forum earlier this year in March, I shared a platform with UK Minister Michael Shanks to talk about how both governments would provide maximum certainty and de-risk these investment opportunities. And in the hours afterwards, when I spoke to a number of people that were present, they couldn't tell me a single thing that I'd said, but they could say how remarkable it was to see a UK minister and a Scottish minister sitting on a stage making the same comments. So it's nice to hear that my words are very forgettable, but it's great that we had an impact in terms of sharing that stage. But it is important that we demonstrate that to investors, particularly where a number of those so-called uncertainties are either within the gift of one government or the other. We also need to work closely with our local authorities because in many cases, some of the most exciting developments are within their gift. The £300 million investment by Barclays in a former industrial site in Glasgow is the largest inward investment project in Scotland. And you can't do that without working with our local authorities. So as I draw to a close, that has been a whistle-stop tour of what we have been doing, what we want to do, and what my priorities are today. So if I accept the offer, or whoever's in my role accepts the offer, to return in a year's time, because making traditions in politics is always dangerous, not least in a year of elections. But if I return, the big question that you will need to ask me is how we delivered against those ambitions and objectives. Because when I came back into government last summer, I had one message for my civil service colleagues, one message for the Director General, one message for the public bodies, and it was this: just get stuff done. We have the investor panel recommendations. They are good, we've accepted them. The task is implementing. Failure to implement costs us, not just in economic terms, it costs us in social terms. And I do not want to see that happen. So I think we have a very compelling roadmap now. It's a very simple roadmap. It essentially has 3 primary objectives across 3 core sectors. I think we've got the ambition. I think we've got the talent. I think we've got the skills. I think we've got the resources to secure a prosperous and sustainable future. And I want to say that you have a government that is determined to create an investor-friendly environment, to transform our economic prospects, to harness the operation of the market for the benefit of our people. And it is my mission to make Scotland the most attractive destination for investment in the UK. Working in partnership with you and many others, I believe that we can and will succeed. Thank you very much.
Please. Well, thank you so much for a lecture that finished on the note that markets are powerful, which is what Adam Smith had recognized. Unleash the markets and they will provide the prosperity, create the opportunities for everyone across society to prosper. And Scotland has so much potential. It had so much influence on world history, and there's nothing that is stopping us from returning to that greatness and reminding the world that Scotland was a leader in understanding the power of markets. So I think your lecture really hit Smith. Looking at you there while you were giving your speech, would have agreed. Now, I certainly have questions, but I don't want to take too much of the privilege as the chair here to limit the engagement with the audience, because I'm sure we have, given the audience we've assembled today, very interesting questions for you to help facilitate not simply this plans of what we're doing, but what's in the future, but what's happening right now in Scotland. So there is a microphone that will be coming around. So for those that have a question, I'll please put your hands up. So first go to Sarah there, please. And if you would tell us who you are and your organization.
Good morning, thanks for your time. I'm Sarah, I'm an entrepreneur in Edinburgh. So my question relates to private investment. How do you think Scotland should position itself in the age of human-level AI?
Thanks very much. Great question to start off with. As the chair back in 2021 of the group that produced Scotland's first AI strategy, I think that at the time we missed just the pace that would unfold in subsequent years and how Scotland could be positioned in that, because we were primarily focused at that point on the ethical use of AI. But I think there's sort of three areas where Scotland can be well positioned. The first is that Scotland has a long history of being at the forefront of innovation, and our universities are extremely well placed on that side of things. So if I look at the developments on an international level, there are still strong connections between developments that are happening in other jurisdictions and our Scottish universities because of the research that goes on at our universities. The key, though, is ensuring that in Scotland, businesses, startups, scale-ups, geniuses, entrepreneurs are working as closely as they can with Scottish universities, and that Scottish universities see a responsibility and an opportunity to work very closely with Scottish startups and scale-ups. So there should be no reason why an AI-driven technology startup feels like it should be relocating in another jurisdiction. There should be the opportunities here in Scotland because of the strength of our academia and research. And seeing as you're sitting next to Scotland's chief entrepreneur, who's Anna Stewart, for everybody who doesn't know, her job is to tell me where we're getting it right and where we're not getting it right in that vein. I think the second thing, though, is about the way that AI is essentially transforming almost every sector. I'm not sure if there are any sectors that anybody can cite that AI is not going to transform. And we will get left behind if we are not upskilling our people to understand either how to make use of it, or secondly, how to either make use of it in terms of driving productivity gains, but also not to be left behind by technology that proceeds faster. And that point around upskilling and reskilling in and around AI is pretty critical. So I think those would be supporting our universities, supporting our entrepreneurial community to be able to work hand in glove with our universities, and then lastly, understanding the implications for wider sector. And it is an area where I think we need to do far more. So it's not an area where I'm sitting here today saying that I think we're there yet.
We had another question here in the front.
Hi there, thank you. Just put my agenda on the table. So I work for a social enterprise support agency, and I'm chair of Social Enterprise Scotland, so go slightly off-piste. You talked a lot about the social impact, economic impact and social impact, and obviously nature of the speech, a lot around private sector, a big private sector investment, big numbers. But I just wonder, with that social impact and economic impact, where you feel social enterprise is at the heart of the economy.
Yeah, so I think social enterprises, visiting a social enterprise captures everything I just said in visible form because of the way that they operate and the obvious tangible benefit they have to communities that they serve. So they are a brilliant model, and they operate extremely well right across Scotland. So as you will know, in areas perhaps that do feel left behind, it's social enterprises that are making the biggest difference in those areas. I think my vision for Scotland is not one where national GDP figures, we want to see growth, so don't get me wrong, we want to see greater growth, and we could do with more growth. But often national GDP figures mask what's really happening in our communities. So you can deliver growth off the back of one location, or you could drive growth off the back of Glasgow and Edinburgh, is my point, leaving the rest of Scotland behind. And that is a completely unsustainable model. We want to see that growth at a local level driving national growth, so places don't get left behind. And social enterprises are usually the foundation stone, I think, of that happening. And there's some absolutely brilliant ones that I have the pleasure of visiting. And I suppose perhaps your question is sometimes they feel like they don't fit into a speech about private sector investment, but nor do they fit in entirely into the third sector. So they occupy that middle space, almost the middle space of the Venn diagram, and are worthy of getting behind and backing.
If we could return to the Scottish Enlightenment, it was the associational life within Scotland that actually reinforced this vibrant intellectual commercial upswelling. So it's not, in Smith, it's not just market or not market. I mean, there's definitely a space, an important space across society, across civil society, to create the conditions that lead to prosperity, that support the private sector, that support the generation of ideas. So I think that's goes hand in glove. It's not one or the other. It's a necessary inclusion in any vibrant, prosperous society. I'm looking around for other questions. We have time for... Oh, lots of hands have gone up. So the gentleman here first, yes?
Morning, Minister. Stuart Wallace from Forth Ports. We've heard you talk this morning about the economy, about housing, about net zero, and we heard at the end of the speech there about just getting things done. I would say still in the broader sense of government, local and national, we have various items of primary legislation that I would say don't allow necessarily that to happen. What's your views around how quickly or how do we move to a position where there is absolute alignment and that officials in various different government departments can act in good faith through their legislation to make sure that those objectives that you talked about this morning actually get delivered?
Thank you very much. So the first element is coherence of vision. So I don't think it's more legislation. I don't think it needs to be more plans or strategies. I think it's the coherence of vision. So I've just set a vision there. That vision is not, quite obviously, doesn't fit neatly into any one single government department. It is a vision for all of government. And so that vision has to then ensure coherence and alignment. Now, in the public sector, here in democracy, there will always be trade-offs. We have different views, we have different priorities, we have different emphases as a nation, as people. So there will always be an element of debate, of tension sometimes around how we achieve something. And I think it's important that we flesh that out. But then on the basis of the vision, determine what's going to take priority. So I talked a lot about renewables. I represent communities that are deeply unhappy at the prospect of renewables being on their doorstep. So we have to flesh those out and give people the opportunity to discuss them. But it's about the coherence of the vision. But secondly, I often feel that it's not about legislation or otherwise when there are issues. It's about having the empowerment or having the wherewithal or having the drive to see an obstacle and figure out how to eliminate it and to cut through it. And that's certainly been my experience over the last year with this approach, is that people will often ask for a meeting in order to fix something. And it's usually fixable, but it requires somebody to own the problem and then fix it. And I don't think here's something controversial, I don't think it's just for the public sector sometimes to fix those problems. And it's about all of us collectively realising that we have a stake in that prosperous future and working collaboratively to fix the problems as they emerge rather than to let them just continue to exist. And most of those are not the product of legislation. They're a product of circumstance or differing views.
Yeah, there seems sometimes to be, and it's just across the world, so much expectation that government must solve all the problems. And actually, we probably need to look more onto the private sector to say, look at all the tools you have, look at all the responsibility you should take. Don't look to government always for the solution or even the impetus to do. I think it's putting pressure on the private sector to do its job, if you like. I want to turn to someone from the diplomatic community. I see our German Consul General with her hand up.
Yes, thank you very much, Deputy First Minister, for this speech and meeting with us. My question would be, how do you see the effects of the recent agreement between the UK and the EU, which in our view, or the view of my government, is obviously something very positive?
Yeah. Yes. So I absolutely agree that particularly on the SPS agreement or the animal and food agreement, we know, and it's been well documented for Scotland's famous food and drink industry, that the barriers at the borders essentially had huge detrimental impact particularly for perishable goods, often knocking tens of millions of pounds of value off. And so to see progress on that is great. There's also something to be welcomed in the sentiment, the positivity, the fact that we can move forward together, which we strongly welcome. You'll have seen my comments and my government's comments about the fact we would have liked the fishing industry to continue to be able to renegotiate on an annual basis. But you'll understand that point rather than being locked in for 12 years. And the only reason that I mention that is because going back to my vision of a bottom-up economic prosperity and economic growth, it's supporting some of those areas that feel left behind in that and to benefit significantly from that industry. But by and large, on the SPS agreement alone, utterly remarkable to see that negotiated, and hopefully we'll continue to see some of the areas that were still subject to further discussion. We'll hopefully see those progress.
Right, so the Deputy First Minister has a busy schedule, so I don't want to take up too much more of her time, but I do want to give the opportunity for at least 2 more questions. There were some hands that were raised.
Thanks very much. Deputy First Minister, I'm really interested in how far you see the limits of government's role within the economy. The last time I sat in this room was to discuss Adam's recent book, which is highly recommended, of course, but that discussed the increasing propensity of governments around the world to invest directly in a deliberate effort to change the structure of their economies through industrial policy. So in that global environment, is an approach that focuses on de-risking, particularly FDI investments, is that sufficient to realise the Scottish Government's ambitions. And in particular, I mean, you would hope through the net zero transition, in particular, we would be building Scottish companies, domestic companies of scale that are able to compete in global markets. Is that de-risking approach sufficient to realise that particular objective?
I think public investment is helpful, but not sufficient, to use your words. And if I take the offshore wind sector, it's a really good example. So part of the reason for the attention, the interest, isn't so much to do with what the Scottish Government has invested, but the government's ambition when our original targets were completely exceeded. So if you recall, with the ScotWind leasing round, we had a target of 8 gigawatts. We got bids for 25. And we had to decide whether or not to keep it at 8 gigawatts or to tear the plaster off and say, no, actually, we're going to go big here. That, not £25 million, was what created the hive of activity. And the interest is what gave confidence to the supply chain investments. Ardseer Port would not have happened. Sumitomo probably wouldn't have invested if they hadn't seen that activity being generated by a simple decision to proceed with a 25 gigawatt leasing round rather than an 8 gigawatt leasing round. And baked into the commitments that were made, for every gigawatt, a developer promised to invest £1 billion in local supply chain. So I would suggest that that is where the impact is. Now we have the challenge of de-risking the supply chain before the developers can actually sign on the dotted line. And that's our next goal, because we could develop 25 gigawatts of floating offshore wind, and at the point that they get through their consenting, their CFD allocations, their grid connections, their financial investment decisions, they look around and say, okay, we promised £1 billion to the local supply chain. Where is it? We have to go and tow things. So now the second element of that is financial. It's how does government de-risk investments now, despite those developments not having got over the line, so that when they do get over the line, there's a local supply chain. And that's what people like Stuart and others are involved with in terms of infrastructure, and I'm hugely supportive. So I think in terms of the limits of government, that story probably illustrates my point more than anything else. It's not just about funding, but funding is vital. It's also about clear, consistent targets that in a very uncertain world will remain rock solid.
So I'm going to bring our proceedings to a close. It's great that the Deputy First Minister has agreed to come back next year.
Subject to the caveats.
Or whoever's in office, to make this indeed an annual affair at the home of Adam Smith. I think if there is a Scot that is famous around the world, it often is Adam Smith, alongside whiskey and golf. But it's Adam Smith who is recognizable to the investment community. If you go to Wall Street, you go to the City of London, you say Adam Smith, right away they're going to understand what that means. And it's a brand that Scotland can sell to the world to remind investors that this is a place that has a dynamic economy, that is an open economy, that is open for business, and that wants to drive the next century of growth in key sectors, from AI to biotech, with a great university sector and an associational life that creates prosperity for all. So we will see you next year. If not you, someone else. On that note, please, let's give a round of applause for the Deputy First Minister, Kurt Kidd.